Hello, and welcome to episode number 226 of the Board Game Barrage podcast, a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing. I am Callan Allen, the Red Tank, joined today by Mark and Neelan.
Hello.
Hey.
They are orange and green with envy at my radio voice.
It is especially radio-y today. What's up with the return of Callan Allen?
He's always been here in my heart.
The time when there was only one set of footprints, it's when Callan Allen was carrying you.
I put the team on my back and carried you all.
Speaking of old references, I got a just quick anecdote that happened to me just a minute ago. I was making dinner, cooking some tacos, which went off wonderfully, I should add, before I get into this. But in the background,
That's an important anecdote.
Yeah, that is important. In the background, there was some television show like Entertainment Tonight or something like that, one of those shows. And do you guys know who Christopher Maloney is?
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Okay, he's one of the guys, used to be on Law & Order SVU, and now he's on his own spin-off show.
Okay.
They were interviewing him, and they're talking about, there's currently three. There's Law & Order proper, there's Law & Order SVU, and there's Law & Order Organized Crime going on now. And the interviewer was like, what would you think about, like, combining them all, you know? And he said, you know what? I think it would be great. I think we should do all three and have a triple crossover.
Oh.
Whoa.
So I know there's some discord in the Discord about our use of crossover and the way we say triple crossover counts for three, and that maybe you should do a double crossover for three. But Christopher Maloney himself has endorsed the triple crossover for three. And so don't take it up with me. Take it up with Christopher Maloney.
And there really is, no show that's more lauded or notable.
That show has been going on for like 20 years. So
Wow,
America loves
SVU's
it.
been going on for 20 years?
SVU might be the longest running show on television since 1999. It's going on for 23 years.
Wild.
Are you surprised they haven't done an episode about you yet, Mark? It's a lot of seasons. They've got to be
That's true.
sort of
You'd expect
getting
them
to
to
your
be-
level of crime.
Yeah.
Today, on episode 226 of the Board Game Barrage podcast, we are going to be talking about metagaming. And not the metagaming formerly known as Facebook gaming, but metagaming as it applies to board gaming. There's a lot to say and a lot to debate about what metagaming is and is not, and if it is fun in board games. We've done a lot of adjacent topics related to this, but just wanted to address it at large, given some of the experiences that we have had this past week. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the games we have played. Mark is going to go first with the latest hotness, one of Stefan Feld's earliest games, Rum Pirates. Neelan is going to talk to us about one board game and one escape room, Box 1 and Shamans. And I will follow that up with our first hot take on Crescent Moon, the latest area control asymmetric troops on a map game. Mark, why don't you start us off? We usually put this in order of most boring to most exciting, so that's where you can kind of see that we went Mark first, then we went Neelan's not a board game, then Neelan's board game, and then me coming in with the actual new news, Crescent Moon. Mark, how's that for a segue?
That's fine. Let's just see if that holds up.
I'm just glad that my not a board game is less boring than Mark's board game.
That's right.
That's exactly right. I hope Mark noticed that. Actually, I hope he didn't notice that, but you pointed it out to him.
You made the subtext text. Anyhow, let me ask you all a question. You ever get the itch to play an old school Feld game? You know, lots of ways to get points, lots of little chits to move around and organize, all of that. But you also want to get a little silly with it. You ever feel that way,
I do all the time.
Callan? I can see in your face you do. No need to answer. No need to
You're
answer.
using the word itch and getting silly with it, and I'm saying this episode is writing itself.
Okay. Well, anyhow.
The SVU episode, that is.
Okay. I wasn't sure that's what you're talking about. Well, have I got a game for you. Rum Pirates is an early game from Stefan Feld, one of the biggest designers in the hobby, both in terms of impact on the board game community and height. I think he's like 6'7". Feld has designed a lot of games in a number of different veins, but he's almost certainly most known for making games that are often described as point salads, where everything you do in the game can score you points no matter which path it is. And your goal is just trying to find the most efficient way of getting them. So his most popular game, The Castles of Burgundy, probably representing the pinnacle of that style of game. Rum Pirates shares a lot of that DNA while adding a dollop of wackiness. And this starts right off with the theming. This isn't the staid theming of Castles of Burgundy or Trajan, other Feld games. In Rum Pirates, you are, unsurprisingly, pirates, trying to score the most points, yes, but you're doing this not only by getting treasure or finding treasure maps and getting into fights, but also from going to pubs and, most crucially, fighting for the best places to sleep on the ship. That is crucial. The board in Rum Pirates is a series of roads going in all different directions that meet up at a bunch of intersections all over the place. On your turn, it's really simple. You move the captain, which is a pawn that's shared by everyone, from one intersection to an adjacent intersection where you take the action printed on that spot. And the way you pay for moving to a spot is by leaving one of your color of pirates, you start with 10 at the beginning of the game, in every spot between the two intersections. So, for example, if I want to take the adjacent treasure map action, I would move the captain to that intersection. And if it was, say, 3 spaces between the original intersection and that spot that I just moved to, I would leave one of my pirates in each of those spots, so leaving 3 behind. So if I started with 10, now I would only have 7 pirates left to place. There are a lot of different spots you can go to, so I'll just give you a quick overview. The treasure map spot, for example, come in one of 3 different colors, and if you go to one of these spots, if there's a treasure map chit available in that color, you take one. Each chit shows half of a map in that color, and if you're able to get 2 map tiles of the same color, you have the full map and you score points printed on both halves of the map, but only if you get both halves. So if you only have one half of a treasure map, you don't get any points for that. One of the more fun spots is the treasure spot. So a player who goes there gets the treasure worth a certain number of points, but then there's a roll-off to see who gets stung by the scorpion who protects all the treasures in the game. And this comes in the form of a random chit that will show a number. I think they vary between 12 and 20. And then you take turns rolling a d6 and adding the numbers together. And then whoever hits the number printed on the scorpion piece gets hit and takes the chit, which will give you a negative 2 points. So, for example, if I land on a spot, I get the treasure, and then the scorpion tile associated with it says 14, then I roll a 6-sided die, whatever my number is, Nealon rolls, and he adds a number, and we keep doing that until we have cumulatively hit that number, in this case 16, and then that person who broke the number takes the scorpion chit and loses 2 points at the end of the game. Finally, at any time during the round, of which there are 5 in the game, you can decide to pass and not place the rest of your pirates on the board and instead put them on the ship to fight for sleeping spots, as I mentioned earlier. Once everyone has passed and put their pirates out in that way, you all will now fight for the 3 coveted sleeping spots, which occurs at the end of every round. So this is a weird but interesting and sort of hard to explain part of the game, which happens again at the end of every round. So every player lines up all their pirates in a straight line, which will go above the line of pirates of the player who passed next to the round. So if I go out first with 5 pirates, and then Nealon passes with 3, and Kellen passes to end the round with 4 pirates, I put my 5 pirates in a line above Nealon's 3, because he was the next to go out, and his 3 are above Kellen's 4, since he was the last to go out. So you have these rows of pirates. So 5 for me, in this case 3 for Nealon and 4 for Kellen. And then you work your way from the outside of these lines of pirates, and whatever player's pirates are in the same column have a simple d6 roll-off to determine who wins that battle. So, for example, in the example I just mentioned above, where I have pirates in 5 columns and then Nealon in 3 and Kellen in 4, I'm the only person who has a pirate in that 5th column, so my pirate automatically wins that battle. But then in the 4th column, Kellen and I have a pirate, and so we fight. And the way the fighting works is really simple. The player who passed first rolls a d6, and then each subsequent player rolls a d6, and if they exceed the first player's number, they are now the king of the hill. If they match number or do worse, they are eliminated from that battle. So you keep doing this until there's only 3 pirates left. Then the next one to get kicked out gets the 3rd best spot, which is worth the 3rd best number of points. Then the second last surviving pirate gets the 2nd best spot, and the pirate who wins this roll-off gets the most valuable sleeping spot worth the most points. Of course, Feld wouldn't let your fate rest on unmitigated dice rolls, so you can pick up barrels throughout the course of the game, which you can spend at any time for rerolls. And you'll get, if you're careful, you can get a bunch of barrels, which will give you a bunch of rerolls and mitigate the dice rolling. I don't think this will be any diehard Feld fans' favorite game by the designer, and it won't be anyone's favorite Euro, I don't think. But I did find it silly fun, and I think you need to know that's what you're getting into if you're going to enjoy this. Strategic and tactical play helps, but it won't guarantee success. But it's really, really easy to teach and play, and it takes only about an hour. So while this probably isn't a gateway level game, I think it's probably the closest you'll get with a Feld game, and I absolutely can see it working as a family weight game if you've got people in your life who only know dice chucking mass market games like Monopoly and the Game of Life or whatever. So not going to be many gamers' favorite, and certainly not one of mine, but very much silly fun, and I definitely would play Rum Pirates by Stefan Feld again.
I'm glad you mentioned the family weight thing, because this definitely has kind of that look and production of that type of game. So in a way that was actually kind of surprising, because I don't often associate Stefan Feld with bright, not necessarily bright, but like this sort of production in terms of one that looks like a more classical family game. So it's really interesting to hear that that is actually the case, and it seems to be leaning more in that direction than not.
Yeah, and it's just, again, silly themes, silly even gameplay. There's a lot of like shouting at each other to like, don't roll a 6, don't roll a 6 sort of thing. So yeah, just silly fun.
I mean, is it worth tracking down? Like, it almost feels like we played Isla Dorado.
Yeah.
And is this better than that?
I think so, only because it's sort of simpler. Like, if we had to play Isla Dorado again, I might have to like consult the rule book, and it just felt a little more gamey than I really wanted from that level of game. This is a little lighter, sillier, more shouty.
Cool.
I wanted to talk really quickly about a game I found in Target called Box 1. This is by Theory 11 and Neil Patrick Harris, which is kind of the reason it stood out to me. It was this game that I saw on the shelf, designed by Neil Patrick Harris, cool-looking box, and thought, why have I not heard about this? It is an escape room style game. If you don't know what that means, this is a game that tries to emulate the sort of a feel of an escape room location where you are solving puzzles in order to escape, effectively. The way that this is implemented in Box 1 largely revolves around a deck of cards where you are effectively using the cards in creative ways to come up with answers. There is a little bit more to than that, but one of the things that's maybe a little bit annoying to even start talking about this game is that it is very easy to spoil, and I think some of the joy is in the discovery. It is very surprising in fun ways. It is pretty subversive, and actually this was not planned, but it is pretty meta. It is, yeah. It is a pretty self-referential game that is fun in that sense. Like, it's...
Did you know that you're playing a game right now?
It's not quite on that level.
Is your
of
whole life a game, Neelan?
I will say this. It doesn't take itself seriously in that way. It leans into the complete silliness of what it's doing in a way that I thought was really, really fun. But it has the feeling of... There were like these sort of like internet ARGs that were going around when I was in university, where part of the fun is kind of just trying to see what creative things that they come up with next. And it does that. It's
Did
like,
you view the source on the HTML page, Neil?
that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's just like solving the puzzles requires that sort of level of thinking.
Did you carbon-14 date test it to tell how old it was?
I did not. If you're a fan of the genre, if you like exit games, if you like escape games, this is a game designed to be soloed. It would have very little to provide to anyone trying to do this with multiple players. It's not going to take a huge amount of time, and it retails, I think, for about $25. I wholeheartedly recommend this. I had a ton of fun with this.
Okay, so I saw this at Target, of course, because I was at Target, because I'm often at Target. And I saw, Neil Patrick Harris design and, mass market, and I just thought it would be not very good. So I didn't even give it a second thought. And then I all of a sudden started hearing buzz about it being potentially like an actually pretty solid game, and now you're saying that as well. But I'm interested. You said that it wouldn't work with more players, because I think a lot of escape room games can work with another player, but does this for some reason not really work with two players?
No, I mean, look, there's no reason you couldn't do it with someone. In the same way that a lot of these games barely work at the accounts on the box, like this is quite adamant in saying like, hey, this is intended for one player, and there's not that much stuff in terms of, a lot of the times all you're doing is looking at a card, right? So like if you're willing to like hold that card between you and another player so you can both read it together, like sure, knock yourself out, but...
So there's not a lot of like simultaneous multiple puzzles going on at the same time where you can
not really,
work on
and if anything, I would say that is maybe its biggest knock. It's a pretty linear experience, and in some ways, it's maybe even a little bit too handholdy. They seem to want to make very sure that you're able to progress in a way that sometimes feels a little bit insulting.
Okay.
But that aside, a very cute idea, well executed. That is Box 1. The other game that I want to talk about was partly the inspiration for this topic, which is Shamans. This was a game that Kellen and I played with a group of friends.
Mark, how do you pronounce this word? Don't say it again. Man.
Shaman.
What about shaman?
No, never.
Shaman?
Shaman.
Shaman. Isn't that what Michael Jackson sings sometimes?
I don't know.
There was a lot of contention over how correctly to pronounce shaman and whether people were mispronouncing it.
I've heard shaman.
I've heard shaman, yeah. But Shamans, which is how I'm going to continue to pronounce it, is a trick-taking social deduction game. It probably shares the most trick-taking DNA with something like The Crew, in that it is largely a cooperative game, but as is the nature of most social deduction games, there are traitors among you. Let's say you're playing a 5-player game. 2 of the players are actively working against the team. And what that means is, in the context of a trick that is being played, if anyone plays off-suit, you move this marker closer towards the end of the track. This comet is moving closer towards crashing into the planet, and the bad guys are getting closer to winning. But you don't ever have to play on-suit. Unlike a lot of trick-taking games, if you have a card of the suit in hand, you don't have to play it. So you can at any point lie about the suit of the card you're playing, whether or not you have that suit in your hand, which is where the social deduction element comes on. If I play a card, was I lying about it? Am I actually actively working against the team? Or did I just genuinely not have a card of that suit in my hand?
It does stretch against the very premise of the definition of trick-taking game in the fact that anyone can play any card that they want.
You're not wrong. It's kind of uses that as like the barest framework, but the way that it plays into the rest of the game is whoever plays the lowest card in the trick gets some sort of reward through some sort of item. Whoever plays the highest card in the trick gets to lead the next trick. So there is, some trick-taking baked into the fabric of it, but to Kellen's point, it kind of cuts off a lot of what makes a trick taker off at the knees, in my opinion. Anyway, that said, what you're trying to do by getting these items, you're trying to complete rituals. When all 8 cards of a specific suit have been played, whoever played the last card in that suit gets to activate a ritual. Some of these are related to items. Most importantly, these give you the ability to kill other players. If the good team kills both of the bad players, then they win the round and they all get points. If the bad players manage to make the comet crash into the moon, then they win the round and get points. There's
so
a couple.
The good guys are the shamans, and the bad guys are the shadows.
Yeah, exactly. The shadas. Shadows?
Shadow shaman.
Shadow shaman.
Shadow shaman.
That works. Shaman.
There you go.
Kellen, what do you think about Shamans? You loved it, right?
I did not. I really actually despised it. To me, it felt like a social deduction game for those who don't particularly like social deduction. I found that as a good player, you had no choice in your actions, and as a shadow player, like, your choice was pretend to be good or start throwing in cards and immediately saying, I didn't have the suit. I have to play off suit. You can see the smile, you can see the wink and the nod of where this design came from, honestly. And that feels like where it ends. I think that your experience is going to desperately depend on your player count, right? At 3 players, there's 2 good guys, 1 bad guy. At 4 players, there's 3 good guys and 1 bad guy. And at 5 players, there's 3 good guys and 2 bad guys.
Wow.
Which feels wild in terms of balance. It commits the cardinal sin for me of social deduction games, which is that playing as a good person is boring. Very boring. You basically are trying not to be too selfish the entire game. There's, in my opinion, very little decision making. You play ones to get knives. You use knives to kill the shadows. And, the best moment did come when I erroneously used my knife and murdered a fellow shaman. So that was funny. We had some funny moments, but I was sort of praying for it to end. I don't know if I was praying to the shaman gods or the shadow gods.
It does actually occur to me something which I didn't think about until right now. I think I was bad every round of it that we played, which, I was seeing what they were going for, maybe more than you. I don't think I ever had the experience of just playing the boring, wow, there is nothing to do here but, play a bad trick taker.
Yeah, I think that again, it uses the same thing that happens in Scapegoat, which is that you have to set up before you do something, right? And so in this game, you have to get a knife before you murder. So even if you know what is happening, you have to like move the game state and do a prep action to sort of prevent it from just breaking, basically. And I was just annoyed. And then it devolved very quickly into a metagame. Hey, that's the name of this episode, where because you're trying to get to 8 points, you can actually end up in a round where shadow players are trying to not let other shadow players win. And so they're trying to murder their own teammates so that they can score points, but their fellow shadow does not, and vice versa on the good guys team. So we got into a game state where 2 players, Nealon and one other person, had more points than everyone else. And so no matter what the hidden roll cards were dealt, because they get redealt every round, we no longer really cared about them, and we were just trying to bash on the leader to make sure that no one was able to score points when they were close to winning, which felt degenerate and boring. It's built into the game because there are ways to score points regardless of which team you're on. If you take 2 sort of actions, acquire 2 crystals, you score 2 points. So it's built into it, but I don't know if better players would not get into that game state where 2 players had the most points and everyone else had 0 points. But we got there, and I was just like, please let it be over.
Yeah, this was the crux of the debate that ultimately led to this topic. It was like, how much of this was actually baked into the design of the game, and how much of it was this weird layer that just like infused our session of it. And I guess we won't ever really know. But yeah, I thought this was fine. I don't think I hated it as much as Kellen did. I just thought it was aggressively fine. It felt like in a sea of resistance contenders, just another extremely mediocre social deduction game, which is damning in and of itself.
I do feel like if someone came to me and said, Kellen, you're dead wrong, let's play it at 3 players, let's play it at 4 players, I would do it again because it's short enough. I may bail after a few rounds, but I didn't like the iconography. I didn't like, again, it's very pretty, but it's also very hard to sort of grok at first or second glance, and it involved just a lot of counting. I don't know, for whatever reason, I did not pass go on this one.
Yeah, that is Shamans by Studio H and designer Cédric Chaboussi.
All right, we have saved the best for last. That is Crescent Moon, a new asymmetric area control game from Osprey Games. Thank you so much for the review copy of Crescent Moon. Crescent Moon is a area control asymmetric game in the like of Chaos in the Old World, in the like of Cthulhu Wars, in the like of Root, and in the like of Dune. And since Dune, Root, and Cthulhu Wars are in my top 50 board games of all time, I was so excited to check out Crescent Moon. We have only played it once as a 5-player game. You can only play it at 4 or 5 players, so this is a hot take. This game is played over 3 rounds for the normal game and 4 rounds for the long game, where you only get 4 actions per year, which makes it insanely hard to figure out your moves and what you want to do. All of the factions are super interlocking with a set of shared actions and personal actions. So it's probably best to describe at a very high level the factions. The easiest one is the Warlord. The Warlord faction is attacky/attacky. That is the Warlord. They must attack in order to win. Their nemesis is the Caliph, and they are attacky/defendy. They are sort of the paladin who is trying to bulk up in the fortresses across the board. And then you have the Sultan. The Sultan is the economic infrastructure player focused primarily on money, making more money and doling out the money. They have a market for themselves, a la Dune, where they get all the money that is collected from that market. Then you have the Nomads, which is very similar to the Fremen or the Spacing Guild in Dune, where they control the board. They can sort of pop up wherever they feel like, and they hire out mercenaries, which are different from regular units, which is quite interesting because both the Murshid and the Sultan cannot acquire regular units. The only military units they can get are from the Nomad. And the last faction is the Murshid, which is sort of the influence everything, the sort of I'm going to whisper in your ear Bene Gesserit faction that, of course, I played, and, of course, is the pink color in the game. And all of these factions have different actions. All of these factions have different first-year victory point objectives. You check for victory points every year. All of these factions have different victory point values and conditions that they get throughout the game. What you are doing in the game is buying power cards. Again, very similar to Dune, actually very similar to a PAX game. And you are using those cards and using your actions to establish different types of presence on the board. So there's this idea of military control and influence, and those are two separate things. And you can have a military conflict, you can have an influence conflict. And those are scored separately and involve different amounts of players. Certain factions like the Murshid are very, very good at influence. And in fact, like the rulebook says, don't focus on control or you're going to lose. Right? Other factions have almost no use for influence as they just sort of ramp up their military and go military, military, military. I have a lot of positives, a lot of negatives. I don't think it's worth it to do the whole rules teach. I will say it took a long time to teach the game, but I would say that it took a little less time than it takes to teach Dune. I would say off the cuff, there's less exception. I would say it probably took more time to teach than Root. I think the rulebook is quite excellent, and I think everybody gets a very good player aid that's sort of a booklet that is 3 pages long. Here are your actions, here's my advice for you, and here's how you score, and here's a reference of all the buildings, units, and types of things that you can build on the back. Neelan, why don't we start with what you liked about Crescent Moon?
Yeah, I think that it's hard to talk about this without dwelling on how asymmetric it is. And I think that is the big appeal for me, for all the reasons you've listed, right? Like, your actions are different. Even when you share actions, your action might work subtly different from the players next to you. Your victory points are totally different. And all of that kind of is why it feels really interesting right off the bat. It's like you're looking at your little booklet and you're just like in awe of all the things that you can do that no one else can do. You know, I'm the warlord. I get to move my units 3 times across the map, so I can get from one side of the map to the other. I can turn all of my influence into military units in a single action and just pop up with this giant horde out of nowhere. I'm the only faction in the game that actually gets victory points for fighting. That's cool. That's exciting. That's something that's pretty unique to this type of game. I would say even more so than a Cthulhu Wars. This feels closer to a Root in just how asymmetric it is. Every faction has a wildly different rule set. So that and how beautifully this is all rendered in terms of the vibrant art style, the setting, which is one that we're not used to seeing all that much. I'm not super well versed on Middle Eastern history, but this is a period of history in the Middle East which is just not often represented in games and seems to have been done with care and with the appropriate cultural consultation. I thought that this game presents right off the bat as something really stunning. I am bearing the lead a little bit here.
No. Positives. We're doing the positive negative game.
Okay.
We're going to get to the negative.
Okay.
I agree with you. The production reminded me a lot of PAX Premier 2nd Edition and Root in terms of some of the screen printing on what was going on in the board and an elegant, understated Euro-ness with like beautiful, vibrant bags. I think the MSRP is a little high. Anyway, my positives. This exists in the sweet spot between Dune and Cosmic Encounter and sort of the PAX-esque Euro-ness, right? It's somewhere in between those in a way that I found quite nice. It's relatively straightforward to teach, and the rulebook is nice. The sort of 2 layers to the area control of influence and presence and control with the military made some of the conflicts really interesting because, you know, in military combats, all of your units count as 1 point, but in an influence contest, all of your military amounts to 1, and you need civilian units in order to score more in those conflicts, which it was fun to think about. And there were some powers that I found quite fun. The Nomad especially had this power where they're sort of everyone is buying for gold, like literally bartering for gold to hire mercenary units from them. And then they have an action called Desert, which is they just pick a spot and all the mercenaries come home and like leave that person who had just bought them. And Daniel of the game table played with us and was the Nomad tribe and did this to hilarious effect. Hilarious. It's like very back and forth bartering. Fine. And, you know, the second he sold him, I think like 2 actions later, he's just like, oh, yeah, I don't have anything else to do. So Desert action. And he took him back. I found it exceptional in that regard. All right, Neelan, now the twist. Now you've buried the lead. Now we go to the negatives. We don't do it like this, but we are today. Do you want me to start or do you want to start?
Unearth the lead. It's been buried.
Yeah, no, please let me. I've been holding it in while you told me to rein in the negatives, and I have to let it out. A lot of what I just described about the asymmetry is great on the surface, can be very, very annoying in practice. For example, when every faction has extremely different victory point conditions, I don't even know what Brandon sitting opposite me, supposedly in the theme of the game, my singular enemy, the faction I am most opposed to, I don't even know what Brandon has to do to win the game. Suddenly Brandon tells me, oh, I get 8 points because I had more hexes. And I'm like, wait, that was even a thing? And obviously that is something that would come out over the course of play. Like, you're not supposed to be secretive about your victory points, but they're also hidden. So you're kind of not supposed to know as the game goes out. To be clear, they're hidden trackable, so you're aware when they're coming, but you're not supposed to know who's in the lead by the end of the game. I found that combination a little bit annoying. I have an issue with card rows. This is personal.
I definitely have this on my negatives as well. It reminded me of in Root when you are the Woodland Alliance, and in newbie groups, the Woodland Alliance just wins because it's really unclear where their board presence is, and then all of a sudden they are winning. It took us about half the game because your scoring conditions are only in your book. And so it's not hidden, and so we would pass them around. But one of the endgame objectives that everyone had was control the holy site. And we kind of all realized that, oh, the holy site is important. But get this, the holy site for the nomads is only worth 2 victory points per round. For the warlord, it's worth 4 points. For the caliph, it's worth 4 points. For the murshid, it's worth 5 points. And for the sultan, it's worth 4 points. And so, again, the relative value of, okay, it's only worth 2 for the nomads, so they could give it up to the murshid, but who's winning the game because all these victory points have been hidden the whole time makes it really complicated to self-balance yourself unless you're that group that plays it 100 times, which doesn't really happen in modern board gaming.
Totally. And I think it's telling that the one victory point condition that all factions shared is still different between the factions, you know? And because a lot of them are all wildly different. I want to say something really quick, which I thought was kind of cute and actually kind of good about the victory point system, is that there is one objective that every faction has which only applies in the first round, which kind of felt like a good, hey, this is what you ought to be doing. This is how to set yourself up well for the second half of the game, which I thought is a cool idea. I thought that was great.
And that goes a good way to describe that, right? The Sultan started the game with what felt like $20. The Nomads started the game with $0, right. And the Nomads' goal was acquire $2 right. in the first year in order to hit their victory point objective for that first round.
Yeah, which for some factions like the Sultan would seem absurd. Yeah, I thought that was a novel way to handle tutorializing while baking it into the fabric of the game. But let's get into another, what was a huge negative for me, right? This game only has 12 actions in the normal game, right? And sometimes that is a very compelling thought. I'm going to take one action that is going to be the 12th of my game. But the problem with that I found is that it often meant that I would say, look at the cards, for example, and say to myself, well, these cards seem really good to me, but is that worth like 10% of my entire game? It kind of forced my hands in ways that I didn't think was in the name of fun.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I would go one further. I actually found the cards to be super underwhelming in comparison to like Dune. A lot of the combats ended up being like 4-3 or 3-2, and then a card was like, you know, -1 combat power to your opponent. And it's sort of like, oh, okay. And on top of that, one of the interesting things is that all the cards correspond to one player, and you actually pay that player for the cards. And the cards are sort of getting cheaper and cheaper as no one buys them, a la any PAX game. But, you know, I ended up in a position where someone bought my 6 coin card at nothing. I did nothing, and then I got 6 coins, and I turned that into quite a few victory points by dealing with the Nomad player. It just felt silly, and you know, my faction, the Murshid, actually has over double the cards of other players, so that's baked in, but it leads to a fragility that I did not like most of all. In essence, I would say it's more fragile than Cthulhu Wars, less bombastic than Dune, and not nearly as charming as Root. Full stop.
Yeah.
And the metagaming, right? And so we can set up the scene and transition to the feature topic like the slick podcasters we are, like the award-winning podcasters we are. Neelan played the Warlord faction, and Brandon played the Caliph faction, which must be at odds with each other, right? Everyone else is hiding on the board and trying not to get in the way of these two formidable foes. But I couldn't get Neelan and Brandon to attack each other. And about halfway through the game, I sat there and thought, is it possible for the other three factions to win if these two just Brandon sits in his bases and hoards victory points and Neelan attacks all the weaklings on the board? And I don't know, because we only played it once, and this is a hot take, but still, it was very frustrating because Neelan and I got into a meta argument about Kellen always complains, blah, blah, blah. He's close to winning, but he's not winning. When Neelan, in fact, was closest to winning, but he was not attacking Brandon enough, in my opinion. Brandon did not win, of course. Neelan won the game, of course. But it just was a position of relative powerlessness. And I find a game like Cthulhu Wars does the best job of having variable ways to win with a common core that still feel like you have agency. And in this game, it feels so fragile, so interconnected that it can just not be fun. And again, that gets to the metagame where it's like, if everybody can attack everybody, then if everybody gangs up on me, then I'll never win the game. And to those people, I say, shut the up, right? But in this case, it's just all of that. It's all of that to the nth degree. And your group may love that, but I just don't know. I'm excited to bring it out again. I'm excited to play it again. Want to take it to Strategicon and try to get another group to play it. But it's going to be a group that's never played it before. So I'm not going to get to that position where this will shine. And, I've already got 3 of these games in my collection, so it's just like I squint at it and I go, what will I do with Crescent Moon?
Yeah, it reminds me, it's not unlike Oath in that regard, which is to say that if you had 4 to 5 players and you were dedicated to playing this all the time as the game that you were playing once a week, you could evolve a meta that feels fun. But unlike those games, I think Crescent Moon really wants you to play it a specific way. And I'm not convinced that it's fun unless you try to play it the way that Crescent Moon wants you to play it. And that felt like a big problem to me.
Here in the 1 minute mid-cap, 5 episodes ago, we drafted the 501 to 600 best board games on Board Game Geek. We had collections. You all answered, hundreds and hundreds of you. Wow, wow, wow. And I hate to say it. Well, I love to say it. I won with 60% of the vote. 60%.
That's a drubbing. That's domination.
My collection of Comet, Blood and Sand, Blitzkrieg, Camel Up, Furnace, and Space Empires 4X dominated the competition of Quantum, Pax Porfiriana, Colorado, Imperium Classics, and Fort, and also the collection of Through the Desert, Pax Renaissance, Cuba Libre, Nova Luna, and Carson City. Wow, wow, wow. There has never been... Actually, I think there has been one other time where it got worse. And let's never forget when Quinns and Neelan banned Concordia as the first pick. That can go down as the worst thing that has ever happened. I am scrolling
as a bet.
Yeah, you're a liar.
We did. Why would we do that otherwise? Anyway,
the winner of the $50 gift card to the retailer of your choice. Your email address starts with M, ends with N @gmail.com, and you will have an email before this episode airs asking you what retailer you would like your $50 gift card to. We prefer Target. You can prefer whatever you want. Thank you so much for participating, and we will continue with the Fantasy Draft series. All right. So for our featured topic today, we wanted to talk about metagaming, and I think we should start by defining what metagaming is. Mark, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I mean, I think metagaming can take a couple different flavors, but when I think of metagaming, what I think of is strategies that emerge in game groups over the course of playing the same game a number of times. When I think of metagaming, that's what I think of. So, you play Blood Rage with the same group over and over and over again, and then there are sort of ways that your group plays it and ways that you counteract plays. And there's sort of like, just a, for lack of a better term, like a hive mind sort of way that you approach the game.
So I had always thought, and I'm probably wrong, that it had more to do with strategies and ideas that weren't baked into the rules of the game, hence the sort of meta-ness of them, which is sort of like a really bad example is that X player always wins, and so everybody will gang up on that person. That's sort of using this like meta texture or knowledge about them in a way that like changes the game state.
Sure. And
Yeah.
I think that's the other major definition of metagaming when I think of them.
I think they're also like kind of the same thing, just depending on your perspective, right? Because if I could offer like a third thing, like it's something that is specific about the way you play a game, that is specific to a specific group or a community, right? Like we talk about the meta of a game in certain countries or in certain points in time, right? The meta changes from like one year to the next. And like some of that is, okay, the meta of how a game is changing over the course of us playing the game right now. This is what came up in Shamans, you know? We knew what the rules for the game were, but slowly a new meta that was not prescribed in the rules was kind of evolving, which was like, oh, these two players are especially close to winning, so the entire focus now changes to forget the win condition, forget crashing into the moon. We have to stop Daniel in particular from winning, whether you're good or bad, you know?
But like make it very specific, right, to Crescent Moon, right? My hypothesis was that if the Caliph and the attacky, which was you, did not fight, I would lose. And so that's potentially baked into the game.
Sure.
Right? So how can you define that as meta when it's like core to the game? Or would you say that like these asymmetrical troops on a map style games are the closest thing to like predefining the meta for you?
I think that's a little bit of like what I was alluding to with Crescent Moon, right? Like, it kind of wants to have its cake and eat it, where it's like, hey, this is a game where a fun meta can evolve. Let's see if you can figure out how these factions are supposed to interact with each other. But it is very much baked into the core of the game. And, you know, I was just lauding like the way that it tutorializes each faction as a positive, but you could see that as a negative, right? It very specifically wants you to go down certain routes. It almost wants to tell you, this is what we feel the meta for this game should be, and let's see if your group gets there. And, you know, my suspicion with Crescent Moon, and this is not borne out after one game, obviously, is that there isn't a different meta that can evolve. But that's where this gets really interesting as a topic to me. It's kind of like, what are the metas that are intended by the designers, and what are the ones that feel sort of genuinely novel and emergent within a specific group?
And so do you find like the concept of building a deck outside the game to also be metagaming? Because isn't that how they use that word in like Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering?
Yeah, that's kind of where I first heard about this, right? Like the meta of like Magic the Gathering. These are the two decks that are worth playing. You're going to play Tooth and Nail, and you're going to play it against... God, that's a dated Magic reference. But anyway, you're going to play that against this particular deck format. And like that was the meta in the tournament scene for a long time. And that wasn't, to my understanding, something that the designers intended. That was just what certain players found. Oh, these are just an unbelievably powerful, strong pairing of cards. So we're going to build every deck around them.
It just strikes me that this definition feels super loose. And maybe that's okay, but it's like, you know, in a social deduction game, when you act like potentially good or bad, no matter what roll call you do get, so that in future games, you know, like actually this is something that we can get specific. Neelan is de facto believed because he is a good and honest person. I am de facto mistrusted to the point that in Crescent Moon, Neelan employed the Kellen metagame strategy, which was to start saying, well, I'm not winning, I'm losing, about halfway through the game, when in fact he wasn't, and he even admitted at the end that he was doing it intentionally. But everybody believed him. What do you think about that, Mark?
That's the meta within our group, right? That I'm the good guy. Can't help that.
Yeah, I wasn't there, but I can't believe Neelan would do that. He's such a good, honorable guy. I always trust him implicitly.
That didn't happen, right?
Let's talk about another specific example I think that comes up a lot there, right? Which is like, in the context of like cooperative games, Hanabi, for example. I think this is probably one of the most divisive conversations you can have about metagaming where Hanabi doesn't dictate to players how they should play the game. But one thing that happens a lot in groups is a meta forms. This is what you should do. This is what you're expected to do. And if you don't do this, you're playing Hanabi wrong. Is that a form of the same sort of thing?
I don't know. It's interesting because when you brought that up, the other big metagame example that I think of is a game that you used to like, Neelan, but now you don't anymore, Resistance.
Yeah.
For example, I know that some groups who play Resistance over and over again have like metagames with how different roles should be played. Like if you're the Merlin, you're expected to withdraw, or if you're this, you're expected to do that. And I think with Resistance, the metagame and metagaming in general, for me, feels more tasteful than in Hanabi, which is, I'm fine with people playing Hanabi whatever way they want. And a big reason that that's true for me is that it's cooperative. So if you want to play Hanabi where you're allowed to sort of wink if something's that, and you sort of build up this second language, where to me it feels like you're sort of breaking the game in again, for me, not fun way, you know? So for me, like these feel of a piece, these two examples of metagaming feel of a piece, but the Avalon example where it's doesn't really affect, I think, the competitiveness of the game. I think if there was a metagame, and there might be a metagame in Avalon that quote-unquote broke the game, I would have trouble with that. But I don't know if that exists or has been proved out or whatever. I know that a lot of, I think Kellen mentioned this, a lot of social deduction game or hidden trader games, the meta game is like, if you're the bad guy, just play it straight, and that's the best way to play it mathematically. And so that sort of will be a meta game that sort of bugs me because it breaks the enjoyment of the game. But yeah, I think that's where I sort of land, where Hanabi's metagaming does bug me, whereas Avalon not so much.
Well, it's like Hanabi's metagame is cheating, in my opinion. So maybe that goes beyond the scope of what you're asking, right? Because Hanabi is very explicit about what you can and can't communicate, and so all the hidden rules are ways to communicate outside the scope of the rules. But that is what Hanabi is,
right,
as a group, right? You know, is to figure out how to get better at the game together in the scope of the rules. And so it goes to the spirit of the game. But, you know, I've read reports on our own Discord of people joining Hanabi games on BGA and then getting flamed for not playing it right, which is just absurd.
Yeah.
Absurd.
I've had this experience in Resistance. I remember one of the earliest times I played the Resistance at a convention. Would have been like maybe 8 years ago. I didn't know anyone. I was at the convention alone, and most of the players at the table were playing for the first time. There was one person really obnoxiously, about 2 votes into the game, was like, if people are going to vote like this is not how you play the Resistance. I'm going to leave. And literally, after the 3rd vote, that's it. I can't handle this. You guys are playing this like idiots. I'm out. Wow, bearing in mind, most people were playing this for the first time, and he had such a specific idea of what the meta for Resistance was, in a way that was like, this is the way to play the Resistance, and if you don't do it this way, you're wrong, which boiled on the absurd for me.
So I want to talk about the Root and Vagabond, and then also like Crescent Moon, which I don't mean to pick on, it's just the most recent game. Like, let's say that we could prove, which we can't, we 100% can't, I want to be very clear, that you and Brandon needed to fight in order for me to have a chance at winning the game. Like, that had to happen.
Sure.
That was tantamount to I lose if that doesn't happen. And you guys don't do it, and it's halfway through the game, 2/3 the way through the game. What am I supposed to do there, right? It's like similar to the Vagabond in Root, which is that if no one attacks the Vagabond wins, but attacking the Vagabond is not that beneficial for you. So often it's up to the leader to attack the Vagabond, or whoever can do it without sacrificing their own game. But if no one attacks the Vagabond, then the Vagabond wins. I think that problem is solved in Archipelago, right, where someone may actually be a hidden traitor and you just don't know it. But in Root, I just don't play with the Vagabond. I have removed it from my box or boxes of Root. But how do you, like, I get why this Resistance player is a tryhard. I totally get it. And I'm not a tryhard. I want to just say that on record. In no way could I ever be construed as a tryhard. But I had genuine feelings about halfway through Crescent Moon where I said, I can't build board presence. My manual is saying, don't fight for control. You won't win it. And you guys weren't doing enough to interrupt each other's infrastructure that it felt like I could not win. Now, to be fair, I got very close to winning.
Right.
We tied on the first tiebreaker, and that's That's because I'm very devious and I conned other players out of their victory points, which the game rules couldn't account for. But what do you say to that, not tryhard, just to be clear, what would you say to that totally normal person? Like, it's like Puerto Rico, right? Where the player to your left or right, whatever, it matters what they play. And if they play poorly, that person wins among experienced players. How do you police actions without metagaming or, I don't know. It's hard. It's a hard one when it's so interdependent.
Totally. I think, like, if the games don't lead to a understanding among the table about what an appropriate way to play the game is, then it's hard to fault the game for that, because some of this comes up in party games, right? For example, like Sixes maybe springs to mind, where there has to be this shared understanding about what a allowable answer that fits a category is, right? And if you're just picking something that barely fits the category, then you're not really playing the game. And we introduce in our group, like, the voting on an answer system, right? To, like, decide whether an answer is appropriate for the category. I think this litters a lot of games, especially ones that are socially oriented. Like you alluded to Archipelago earlier. That has the problem where if you don't treat wanting to tank the game as a viable strategy, then you're kind of not really playing Archipelago. Yeah. Is that baked into the rules of Archipelago? I don't know. It feels like something that I remember you telling us prior to our first game, but in my opinion, that made the game better.
Well, and in Archipelago specifically, it does have a concept of a winner and then a grand winner, which is like surviving is winning and then winning the most is grand winning. But our group could not tolerate that level of there can only be one winner. Right, so that's a metagame unto itself. What about the idea of using external information? The point I'm trying to make is, can we police this through the type of game that is being played, which is to say that, like, for example, in a hidden traitor game, using someone's facial reactions to "Are you a liar?" is a fair and fun thing to do. You know, Neelan, are you the Cylon? You know, and Neelan's the Cylon, you know, and everyone's sort of goofing and joking like,
Neelan would never be the Cylon.
Neelan played the red card, you know, he's the Cylon, ha 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 ha. Versus what I've seen happen a lot in games like Codenames and in games like So Clover, people will sometimes say, I think it's this answer, and then they'll look at the player that is supposed to be holding out and being poker face to try to see if they can, like, suss out a reaction out of them, which feels like straight up cheating to me. But again, is the same type of thing that happens in poker all the time.
Sure, yeah, totally. And that's fascinating in and of itself, right? Like, it's totally part of the game in poker. You reminded me of, like, a pet peeve in, like, say, something like One Night Ultimate Werewolf. When after everyone's eyes are closed, someone immediately says, I feel like I heard Dean move his card across the table. And you're just like, okay, great. You've just ruined the game. Let's just redeal it. Because that's not the game. The game is not listen for who you think moved their card, you know?
But look, I think the Codenames thing is straight up cheating. Actually, I have a friend who, whenever I played Codenames with her, Tabitha, and she's the clue giver, I mean, we have to have her, like, turn away from the board at this point because she will, like, give away things. You just look at her, and like, literally, whenever Tabitha is a clue giver, we force her to turn away because she cannot keep a straight face. That, to me, is straight up cheating. But, like, the One Night Ultimate Werewolf thing, I think if that happens in a game of One Night Ultimate Werewolf, then, yeah, you redeal the first time, but then you make it part of the game. Like, you, on purpose, move around to sort of throw things off. I think that can be incorporated, whereas with Codenames, I don't think it can. That's like a one-way will affect the game. So I think it depends on the game where it can be worked into the game and games where it just ruins it. And the same thing with, like, Root. You mentioned Root earlier. I think that Vagabond, to me, and again, I haven't played Root a ton of times, so I could be off on this, and you'll maybe correct me if I am, but the Vagabond, for me, the fact that the leader or the person whose resources will be affected the least has to keep the Vagabond in check just feels to me straight up bad. It just feels to me like a just negative thing to the game. And same with Crescent Moon. And again, we don't know this to be the case because you guys have only played it once. But if the success of one player hinges on two other players playing a certain way, that would bug me. I think that is problematic. But in other games where the meta, like I said with Avalon, can be worked in, can be adjusted game to game, I think it's less problematic.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, how much you metagame might change the played experience, you know, and so, like, there's an element of how much does Board Game Barrage metagame versus other groups of gamers, and I would say, in fact, we metagame a lot.
Yes.
There's built-in sort of rivalries and information that is leveraged. And we even use that information to like pick factions in a game of Crescent Moon, where it's like, hey, we think this is going to lead to the most excellent experience, so we're even going to pick who's playing what. Like, if Mark had played with us, I would have immediately known he would have won OP if he played the merchant one, so we would not have let him even have started the game as that faction, which is sort of a metagame unto itself. I don't know if you can count the rock, paper, scissors champion moment that we had in our game of Crescent Moon, which may have been the best part as metagaming.
I'm surprised it's taken this long to come up, because as games within a game goes, that had to be the king.
What happened?
So my faction had the power to make deals, which was pretty weird unto itself, which is that if you win the combat, Mark, you can pledge 1 to 5 victory points before that combat starts, and then you have to give them to me if you win, regardless of if I help you or not. But I can play cards either for or against you. So I could play cards against you, but you already pledged 5 victory points to me, and then you still have to give them to me, which felt really fun, But anyway, we had a position where 2 players were both pledging to me, and we forgot to do it, so I had to turn away, and they had to count down from 5 and both hold out their hands on how much they were willing to bid. But we were worried because you can only bid 1 to 5, so we developed this metagame system whereby the opposite players on the table would become the rock, paper, scissors, like gladiators. So in the countdown, they both selected the same number, which was 4, which was way too high. And then Neelan and Daniel had to play rock, paper, scissors to determine who successfully got to be in bed with me. And I scored 4 victory points. Thank you. Did you help me, or did Daniel win
I think that was Daniel.
Yeah, you didn't help me at all. That's not a metagame. I think we can be pretty clear that we just changed the rules of the game there.
Exactly.
What about just socialness in general? Like, is there a parallel relationship between those who like metagaming and those who like social gaming? Or how social is metagaming? Because I feel like most of what we've talked about has felt very social, or using like information about players to like change the game. Are there examples of metagaming that aren't socially based? I guess looking up strategies.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think there are situations where game strategies emerge in a gaming group. Like, one thing that sprung to mind is Blood Rage, for example. Blood Rage has a collection of cards that you use over and over again. It's not as small as like the Inish 18 cards or however many cards are in Inish, but it's a small set of cards, and the same cards come out in Age 1 and Age 2 and Age 3, game to game to game. And I remember playing this a couple times with the same group of people where early on, it was really early in us playing Blood Rage, the Loki strategy was something we weren't expecting, and all of a sudden the player who played Loki just destroyed it, just won the game big. And so it became a thing where the early games people would vie for the Loki strategy, and then it became a thing where we knew the cards to like jump at to sort of disable the Loki strategy. And then it became a thing where now you can't win the Loki strategy, so forget the Loki strategy. But then the Loki strategy became strong again because everybody was forgetting about it. So it's like this thing. It sort of reminds me of like playing basketball. And, you know, one move in basketball that I always loved is like if a big guy is backing you down, and you like push back and you like resist them, and then all of a sudden you move real quick, and that support you were lending them by pushing back, all of a sudden you withdraw it and they fall, they stumble. That's the feeling I get with games that handle meta well. Like, okay, we're doing it this way, okay, now we're switching it. And it like can open up a whole segment or aspect of the game that you would otherwise not consider.
I think that's a cool point. And I always love to see that happen over the course of playing a game, right? When you go into the first couple of games and you just think, wow, this faction's overpowered. And then that very quickly changes once you start to realize how to counter them. I remember this actually happening in the course of our Rising Sun games, where the Fox clan, the Orange clan, one of the expansion factions, was perceived as very powerful because of their way to jump into every fight and then effectively, in some strategies, just commit seppuku and like win a whole bunch of victory points. But as soon as you've seen that trick done once, your meta has changed and suddenly it's not as overpowered as it seemed, right? But like some of that is so baked into the nuances of balance and first-time balance versus long-term balance. It's a hard thing to like get right in the design of your game.
Anyone willing to share metagame strategies that they use to win? Like watching where someone's eyes go on a card row, or pretending to react negatively to something even though it's what you wanted to have happened?
I mean, one strategy that pops in mind, and it's not as social as maybe you're asking for, but Keyflower is a game of bidding, and you're bidding over tiles. And the idea with Keyflower is that if you start a bid in one color, then all subsequent bids must be of the same color. And there's one sort of very light meta strategy that I always employ with Keyflower is watching the way that people make their first bid in any round, because that will probably be the color that they're strongest in. So if I see somebody bid their first bid, they might put one red on something to start a bid. Then in my mind, okay, that person has a lot of red.
They want that the most, or they're going to be able to invest the most.
Yeah, exactly. Probably. So I just keep that in mind on subsequent bids. And that's not always the case. And I sometimes mess myself up because I assume everybody else is thinking that way. And so I will go in with my second strongest color first and then
not get it.
And then not get it. Yeah, because I've committed my second. So, and that's a perfect example of the way that metagames can change the way a game is played over the course of multiple games.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that this is exactly right, but one thing I like to do in social deduction games, especially with players that don't know me, is to play the idiot a little bit, but not in a way that's super obvious. It's just kind of exactly the way you described, Kellen, just being oh, this person doesn't know this game, so they're doing the obvious mistake. Because then you're kind of messing with people's perception of the meta a little bit. It's people have this idea in their head of this is how someone that doesn't know the game would play it, but then you subvert that by countering it. The best example I can think of in this is something like Snakes, for example, where you're trying to trick players into thinking that you know the answer to a question to lead them astray. So you go for what seems like an obvious lie. Oh, I just saw this on the thing yesterday. And it's okay, there's no way that this just happened to be some trivial knowledge you stumbled across. So they think they're catching you in a lie, but meanwhile, you're subverting their expectation. And that only works if someone doesn't know you at all, really, because your ability to pull off, would this person make such an obvious mistake, is based on how familiar a group is with you.
That's interesting. I would say in social deduction games, I try to form a triangle of trust. No matter what, it's always a triangle of trust, and it's based on nothing. It's establish camaraderie with someone, like a classic salesman kind of tactic where oh, we have trust, right? We're the triangle of trust. And I try to name it so that it has presence. And then I try to loop back to it. Oh, you remember, the triangle of trust that we developed, in round 2. I would say that in some Troops on a Map games, I will deliberately lose or get into a conflict very early on that appears to be crippling to me. And then I'll whine about it a little bit to sort of cast myself down. Oh, I'm in last, I often will try to be the first one involved in a combat, regardless of whether I believe I will win it or not, just to sort of feel ski it out and sort of come in at a position of being under the radar. And this may be not even smart play. It may just be a counterplay to myself, which is that I always want to be winning. And so normally, what I want to do is just dominate and dominate and dominate, but that doesn't work. So I'm almost metagaming myself a little bit to try to kind of get under or subvert, I guess, to Neelan's point, what people believe about me as a person. I think that is going to do it for our discussion on metagaming. I would love to hear your definition of metagaming, because it is sort of spiky and hard to wrap your hands. What could you wrap around? You can't wrap I guess you wrap your hands and your head around things. It's both.
Yeah. A really
can you wrap your
bodily
head
hug where you get your head behind the other person's head.
What is the expression now? I don't even know. It could be both. I'm serious.
I think it's wrap your head around.
Yeah.
Why isn't it hands? Like a hug.
I think also wrap your arms around is another thing. I think
true.
Hands. I think you went the wrong way with hands. You got two hands in.
That. I think someone's projecting based on earlier mentioned. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. You can find us in all forms of social media. That is on Twitter at BRD Game Barrage, on Instagram at Board Game Barrage, on Facebook you can find a Board Game Barrage group. On Board Game Geek, you can find a Board Game Barrage guild, and you can talk to us on Discord, where we are talking every day at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Join thousands of other board gamers, talking tabletop, organizing online play, and talking about each other's poor tastes in movies and films.
One quick thing, I will be on an upcoming episode of the Nerd Expansion podcast, which is set to be released on May 24th. It's a show where the hosts, Sasha and Nick, interview folks who are really into things. So if you want to hear me deep dive into my nerddom for board games, give that a listen. It's a really fun show. So that is the Nerd Expansion, May 24th.
Thank you so much to Heart Society for their fantastic song, What's on Your Mind, Kid, from their album Wake the Queens. So long and good night.
Goodbye.
Bye. I feel like Shaman is I want to say, I don't know. I don't know what I was going to say there. I was going to say like an Americanization, but that's so dumb that doesn't make any sense to say out loud. So
And
don't
you
put
are
that
an
in the
American,
episode.
so that would
Exactly.
be insulting yourself.
Well, it's also like I actually do. Anyway,
Yeah.
let us get back.
Yeah.
Is that a giant lemon?
That is not a giant lemon. It's
Is
a
it a
cantaloupe?
pomelo?
What
Oh,
is it?
cantaloupe.
I don't know what
Okay.
it is.
Oh, it just
it's a
looked like
spaghetti
a
squash.
lemon from that.
Spaghetti
It's not a
animal, and I
lemon.
was like,
It's a spaghetti
Get out.
squash.
Okay. This is outro, Mark. Let's
No, I know.
define material.
Can I tell you
Not
something?
the intro,
It's
outro.
such a relief when we get the outro early because
Oh, it's done.
when I start editing and I'm on like a minute 45 or whatever and I still don't have the outro.
This is a giant lemon.
That is a
was
giant
true.
lemon.
Stop it.
That is a
It's
giant lemon.
It's not a visual medium.
this is a trick. You're just bringing the same fruit
Yeah.
back into camera.
Yeah, closer.
It's further away. Yeah, exactly.
Today on episode